Okay, let's keep things moving along. We're going to address the question of Utah's national parks, challenges and opportunities. We have a distinguished panel of experts who are out there on the ground addressing these questions on a day-to-day basis in the work that they do. And I think what I will do is there are 2 or 3 PowerPoint presentations that we'll see, and I think that in light of that, and rather than have everybody come up here and have their back to the screen, I'll just introduce folks one at a time, and we're going to start with Kate Cannon, who is the superintendent of the Southeast Utah National Parks. That includes Canyonlands, Arches, and Hovenweep, and have I forgotten one? Natural Bridges. I knew I forgot one. So Kate, thank you for joining us, and carry on.
Hello everyone, and thanks for being here. It's been wonderful to hear all of the interesting talk about national parks, and it's been encouraging to feel all of the interest and support of this group. So thank you for being here, and I'm glad to be here myself. As Bob said, I'm the superintendent of the Southeast Utah Group, affectionately known as the SEUG, which includes Arches and Canyonlands National Park, Hovenweep and Natural Bridges National Monument. I've got some other Utah time. Years and years ago, I was a seasonal park ranger in the Needles district of Canyonlands. I have, to this day, not quite gotten over that experience, nor ever will. I've also put in some time at Bullfrog in the Utah portion of Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. Also, I worked for 5 years in the mid-90s, right after the establishment of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, as the monument assistant manager and then the manager for the BLM. In between all those times, I went to Alaska right after Anilka and worked 3 different places there, starting with Yukon Charlie Rivers, and also have some time at Isle Royale, North Cascades, the usual kind of Park Service litany. So Bob asked that I start out with a sort of a quick overview of the national parks in Utah, which is really, it's hard to do that quickly. There are 13 national park units in Utah. How am I supposed to do that fast? But I'll try. Let me start from the north with the northernmost Golden Spike National Historic Site, pardon me. And that's the site of one of the nation's most significant historic events, really, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the driving of the Golden Spike to commemorate that on that site 145 years ago this May. We've also got a fascinating world-class site at Timpanogos, a world-class cave where you can walk up the trail, up the mountain, and walk into the mountain to see the cave. It's tremendous. If you haven't been there, you should be going there soon. We've got Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, much of that in Utah, although Arizona has some of it, with its very intricate shoreline, perhaps becoming a little more intricate as the water drops. But that shoreline is as long as this country's entire Atlantic coast, so it's pretty phenomenal. And it also provides lake access to Rainbow Bridge National Monument in Utah, which is, among many other things, a sacred site to Native American peoples. Dinosaur National Monument, straddling the Utah-Colorado border, was established back in 1915, first as a small protected site for dinosaur fossil quarry, and later expanded, adding the canyons of the Green River and the free-flowing Yampa to that monument. And I'm going to lump all the other ones together. The stunning beauty and intrigue and variety of Bryce Canyon, Capitol Reef, Cedar Breaks, Zion, Arches, Canyonlands, and Natural Bridges, and always the evocative standing walls of Hovenweep. Those are the 13 national park units in Utah. What riches we have in Utah's national parks. It's amazing. And it is not a secret. In 2012, 9,503,000 people visited those national parks, those national park units in Utah. Now you have to remember that the population of Utah in that same time period was only 2,855,000. So for every resident of Utah, there were more than 3 park visitors. That year, every year, growing every year. Those people left behind $617 million that year alone. So it's not a small thing for Utah. So you got to wonder, so why do they come here? Why are they coming to the parks? We've talked and heard a lot of people talk about the fact that parks dependably give people something of value. And it doesn't matter who they are or what unit they're in. People always find something to take away of value from national parks, whether it's beauty or peace or inspiration or education or challenge or just plain fun, or whether it gives them a sense, as John talked about, of being a part of something bigger. People dependably take those things back from national parks. And I think they know that parks are a sure thing and dependable, and that's one of the reasons they come. I would actually say that I think the public takes that for granted about their parks. But I also think that part of the challenge is to have that continue. And that's going to take all of us working together to bring about. And why is that? In part, it's because national parks all ultimately and utterly depend on their surroundings. Arches is a really easy example of that, Arches National Park. Have any of you been there? I feel at home. In Arches, maybe you've had the chance to drive along the main park road, and maybe you got out of the car and you stopped at an overlook and you looked out south from there across the rolling red rock in front of you that dives down to the Colorado River Gorge. And then you can see the cliff coming up on the other side. And then you can see the tablelands rising up to the snowy peaks of the La Salle Mountains, usually against a blue, blue sky. And when visitors to Arches see that, they love it. And they vow that they will bring their children back and that they will bring their grandchildren back to see it. And they do. And they love Arches National Park because of that. However, that's not Arches National Park. Virtually everything in that view is outside the park boundary. That's not only with Arches. I think that's in many ways the case for all national parks. Certainly it is for Canyonlands National Park, where you can stand at Grandview Point and see 100 miles. You can look out across that whole basin to the Henrys and Navajo Mountain and the Blue Mountains and the La Salles. That's mostly not Canyonlands, but it's the stunning view that people value there. I think that all of our parks, particularly those, but I believe all of them, depend on their surroundings for those 100-mile views. They also depend on those surroundings for the clean air that lets us see those views, the quiet that allows peace there, and don't forget the inky dark skies that let us see all of the stars. All of the stars. Someone talked yesterday about being part of something bigger. That's part of being something bigger. All of us depend on the neighbors and on the surroundings, locally, regionally, and nationally, for the protection of what's valued in parks and about parks. I should say that I, for one, am very appreciative of the crucial role that the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service lands play in this picture. They provide the landscape that we and those 9,500,000 visitors to the parks treasure. And whether they know it or not, it is that whole landscape that people come to see and experience it is that whole landscape that has to be sustained to keep them coming. That's really the challenge. So, how do we remain dependable? How do we remain taken for granted? How do we continue to return that great value? I have some observations on that that really don't differ from the kind of observations superintendents all over the system have. But I tend to think that Utah parks are like all the other parks, only more so. Some of the things that we have to pay attention to if we're going to continue to sustain these parks are that parks also depend not only on the surroundings, but on being very actively managed. Very actively managed. That's probably one of the single things, aside from our relatively small size, that sets us apart from other federal lands in the areas. In order to very actively manage land, you have to be well-staffed and well-funded. Those are big challenges, but they're essential to the success and the sustainability of parks. Parks also depend on placing limitations on use. Now, increased federal funding and limitations on use are particularly hard sells for Utah parks. It's just the politics and the culture of the place that is perhaps more resistant to those thoughts than other parks in other states might find them. But if you think about it, think of when you go to a park. You go through a gate. You have to stop and talk to the very nice ranger and get all the rules and regulations. You may be asked to leave your car and to take a shuttle. That's a limitation on your use, isn't it? You may have to get a reservation for a campsite or a permit to go into the backcountry or to take a river trip. And when you take that river trip, you have to bring a fire pan so you don't leave ashes, and you have to bring a toilet so you don't bring other things, so that the next visitor there can enjoy it in the same pristine state that you saw. Those are all limitations on your use. It's not just your use, but we get all kinds of proposals for other uses, as all parks do. Competitive events, races, rallies, the filming of movies and commercials, art events, music performances, weddings, the scattering of ashes. All of these things we consider, we permit, we limit, we restrict, and sometimes we deny. One of my fellow Utah superintendents brought up another topic that I thought was kind of interesting. We've talked today about how we welcome and encourage younger generations to come into the parks. We want them to learn to love the parks and use them. But I also realize that we balk when we see how they want to enjoy those parks with the technology and their penchant for extreme sports and their wish to climb up to high spots with all their pals and take a picture and send it back home. We balk at that. Likewise, we balk at many of the new uses which are very prevalent in the Utah parks. Those include base jumping, pack rafting. We've even had some now who bicycle to a trail route, hike down the route, go to the Colorado River, pack raft across it with their bicycle, and cross over to the maze and do the same in reverse that way. We balk at this. We don't quite know what to do about it, and it takes us a while to figure it out. We also now have a lot of model airplanes carrying video cameras that one visitor came in irate describing as a flying weed eater with that sound. They do sound like that, and it's incompatible with watching the sunrise, some think. What else? Oh, reality TV shows want to be filmed in parks. All kinds of motor vehicles that people love and their favorite motor vehicle, they want to be able to ride it in the park. And the same is true for non-motorized vehicles. So even though these are all really just expressions of what people personally value in parks, we have to limit them in order to protect what people value. And we have to place those limits in ways that can be supported by the public, effective, affordable, and palatable. That's the real challenge. So that's my comments and thoughts about Utah challenges and opportunities. I'm really glad to be here with these three partners who are all very much engaged in trying to solve these same things. And Bob, do you want me to introduce Ashley? Ashley's my neighbor in Moab. And come on up, Ashley. Ashley is the proprietor, owner, would you say, of Western Spirit, of a large outdoor adventure company, and she has recently co-founded Solutions, which is a nonprofit dedicated to trying to knit together the various recreation uses and development uses on public lands and parks. Close enough? Close enough.
How exciting. Thank you. Wait. Okay. So I'll just give a little more background. Our company, Western Spirit Cycling, does bicycle tours on the public lands. We're headquartered in Moab, but we run trips all over the country. We're one of the largest holders of recreation permits on the public land system. And I served as the president of the International Mountain Bicycling Association, and then helped them work on the issue of bikes and wilderness. Since bikes are not allowed in wilderness, it was a little bit of a problem for the bike industry because they see themselves as the answer to everything from obesity to clean air, and they didn't want to have a fight with the environmental community over wilderness boundaries. So we worked hard to create something called the Public Lands Initiative at IMBA to work out those issues so that the bicycle community could support a lot of land protection proposals around the country. And that led to the creation of Public Land Solutions, this consulting group that I'm working with now that's bringing stakeholders together and bringing the business voice into the conservation conversation. So I'm going to talk about all of this really from a business perspective. I went to business school and then worked on Wall Street. Bad idea. And then ended up working in the bike industry and came to Moab and bought Western Spirit. So my perspective and my thinking about a lot of this stuff comes from that training of looking at it from a business proposition and a sort of value chain analysis of who does what and how does the money flow through. But so when you really look at the way the national parks work in the recreation economy, and this is in Utah but everywhere too, is it's the anchor tenant at the mall. You didn't think I was going to talk about the mall, did you? And so when you think about that, like the mall is, there are all these stores, right? And then there's Dillard's, right? Or Nordstrom's, or some big store that's kind of special and kind of expensive and kind of, you know, like if you're getting a really important item, you're going to go to the fancier store. It sort of has this, you know, how does that make you feel when you go to, whoops, went the wrong way. So when you go to the fancier stores, you're having a special experience. And so I want to come at the parks from that perspective. So generally, backing up and looking at the recreation industry, there are 6.1 million jobs, $646 billion in annual spending, almost $40 billion in tax revenue, federal, and another almost 40 in state or local. So, you know, those numbers, what do they really mean? How do they compare? So it's pretty interesting when you look at outdoor recreation as compared to all these other supposedly much more serious industries. But as you can see, we're right in there. Bigger than oil and gas, as you can see. So when you say, okay, let's go back to the mall now, and we're talking about how the park plays a role in these gateway communities. So when you look at a place like Moab and what people come to do there and how the park fits into that product mix. So when you go into the park, you have a lot. When you live in Moab, people turn up all the time, right? And one of the things you've got to do with all your visitors is you've got to take them into the parks. And so why? What if the park weren't there? They could still go mountain biking and boating and motorized or all these different activities. But what is it about the park that adds to the product mix? So it's more precious, right? And it's unique, gives you this special feeling, and you're on extra good behavior when you're in the park, right? So there's this issue of sort of restriction versus letting the people base jump or letting them fly their cameras or whatever it is they want to do. And that tension is an interesting challenge because I think the issue of relevancy in the parks and keeping youth interested in the parks, we got to let them do something when they're there besides just drive around and look at the views, right? So I think that's a natural tension, and we don't want to go too crazy suddenly letting them do everything, but at the same time we should look at activities that might be compatible with the parks that would also speak to youth. Here comes my mountain bike plug. So the high school mountain bike racing is taking off. Like, I've been to millions of conferences where everybody complains about no youth in the out of doors. And the Utah League for the National Interscholastic Cycling Association went from 150 kids last year to 600 this year, and it's positioned to grow again. So there is that opportunity maybe to think about, could we get the people out of their cars and put them not so much in the back country, but on the front country as a way to, that might be an opportunity to sort of bridge to younger people, add an activity, get folks out of their cars that would be compatible with what we're trying to do with the parks. Okay, so when we talk about sustainable gateway communities, they have the right product mix, and the park is a key portion of that product mix that, like we said, it's the anchor tenant. It's a key part of what makes a sustainable gateway community. So if you try to look at other places that we could maybe make a park, or that we could, or that are trying to become gateway communities, you know, if you only have one type of enthusiast that's visiting your area, like for example in Hanksville, it's pretty mostly motorized. That's difficult to build a sustainable gateway community around one type of visitor. Really, you know, the marketing power of the national parks, I think we saw during the shutdown, the reaction of the community to that problem really you know, showed how powerful the parks act as a marketing tool. And then, you know, my company wasn't very interested in Capitol Reef until the Grand Staircase came along. And then all of a sudden it was enough acreage and enough mileage to do an actual bicycle trip. So that point about these surrounding areas also affects the economics of trying to develop a sustainable community. So the budgetary challenge is there, you know. Basically we're competing against Disneyland, right? In terms of where people are gonna go on vacation and spend their dollars. And so underfunding the park, or even a rumor of underfunding, is a problem. Because when you're planning your family's vacation and you think the park might be partially closed, or there may not be bathrooms, or you might not get to go on this road because of underfunding of the parks, you might choose to go somewhere else. But the crazy thing is that unlike, I don't know how much they spent to build Disney World, but unlike that, the return on investment on public lands is incredible. When you look at places like Dead Horse State Park, spent $40,000 on trails and doubled the revenue of that park in 2 years. So when you build trails, and the return on investment is really high. But we all still kind of view recreation as some kind of luxury that we only fund after food and energy. Like, we subsidize agriculture, we subsidize energy, but we don't subsidize people getting outside. And that point that the local parks, they hate them, the local communities don't like the parks, and then when they get them, they take them for granted. It's a special place to be. Okay, so the lands beyond the park, you guys have seen, are really critical to how the parks function. And And the problem right now is that the current laws definitely favor resource extraction. If you look at the past and you look at history, you see that so much of the system developed to facilitate resource extraction. And there is no such thing as a Recreation Protection Act. We learned that during the 77 leases. So using this recreation economy to protect the lands around the parks is something that there's a real opportunity to do more on. I think the idea of, if you think about land ownership, right? In the history of people, the people who owned the land, land ownership was a mechanism for wealth generation, right? The people who owned the land were the people who could make a living. And if you didn't own land, how were you going to make a living? And I think that's a really big part of why there's this local resentment about public lands and more restrictions on public lands and more parks. But when you think about life in the 21st century, making a living off the land has a whole new meaning. And wealth generation, the wealthiest people in our society today didn't get there necessarily by land ownership. It's a whole new world in terms of how wealth is created, and it's not directly tied to the land. And in fact, public land provides wealth to communities in a new and different way. And then obviously recreating gives you that opportunity to connect to the land. So the opportunities that we have to conserve lands, one of the ones that Kate and I have been working very hard on lately, and David as well, is the master leasing plan in Moab, which we are really working to communicate directly with the oil and gas folks between the recreation businesses and saying, wait a minute, you're putting our livelihood at risk, and how can we work together above and beyond what the regulations are to sort it out acre by acre. And then you probably all know that Congressman Bishop is working on a public lands bill, and we're all working hard on that. And then there's the possibility of just reaching out to the oil companies themselves directly and saying, we need to cut a deal with you. And they seem interested so far, and there's lots of interesting reasons behind why they might be willing to do that. So bottom line is that there are so many places now in Utah that are very interested in being part of the recreation economy. Everybody wants the dollars. And so now the question really becomes, how can we use that interest in the recreation economy and lots of communities and counties wanting to be part of that? How do we move them, help that movement overcome the traditional, we don't like federal land and we don't like restrictions? So those two forces working against each other are really what provide the opportunity and the motivation, I think, for possibilities of more and bigger parks. Okay. I'm going to be bad. I'd rather introduce David. I know David better. But Vicki, we're very happy to have Vicki playing the role that she's playing at the state level, because it is connecting the tourists to the public land. We do so much marketing of tourism, and sometimes we forget to take care of the product. Like, we're so busy telling people to come. So we're really excited that she's here.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here and to know that so many good people are thinking about the strategies that have been outlined over the last couple of days. I remember when the Stegner Center was established 19 years ago now, and it's remarkable to see all the good discussions that have been organized over the years, and I'm especially pleased that so much attention has been paid to state parks over the last couple of days. Building on Kate and Ashley's comments, I guess the first thing I would say is yes to everything they said. It's a complex situation, particularly in Utah, because there are so many historic, there's so much historic dissonance about land use. I think the good news that I've experienced over just the last 3 to 5 years is that Utahns are unifying more around understanding that really Mother Nature played favorites with our natural resources. From the greatest snow on Earth to what we call our Mighty Five national parks. We've really created community unity around protecting those assets and also being generous to welcome the world to experience them and to capture the dollars that come with that. Let me just ask, by show of hands, how many people are familiar with the Mighty Five? You would hope that with this audience. This is the probably highest response I've gotten anywhere I've spoken. And the reason for that is that the Mighty Five campaign, which I'll show you in just a minute, it was launched a year ago by our office to promote the Mighty Five national parks to tourists all along the West Coast and then in surrounding western states, and a fair amount of international promotion as well. So to give you a little background, we've been doing ambitious marketing campaigns for since about 2006, when our state decided to really take tourism seriously. And our 3-season campaign usually had a storyline that would be very familiar. You've probably seen some of the ads. It's basically, come here, you can do it all. You can bike, you can backpack, you can river raft, and so forth. The challenge with those campaigns is they didn't differentiate. They didn't follow the first rule of marketing, which is to help people understand that your product is the only place they can have a unique experience. So the Mighty Five was a breakthrough blockbuster campaign for us last year when we honed into the message of the Mighty Five national parks. I present to you the Mighty Five.
Picture this, your next trip, Utah. Picture this, your next trip, Utah. 5 national parks. First, Zion. You're walking. The ground rises. The ground drops. The ground becomes water. Next, Bryce. You're riding a mule. You're riding a mule under giant orange strip castles. You are not dreaming. You will not forget this. On to Capitol Reef. Take the scenic route, the really scenic route. Take a path you've never taken and see the stars for the first time. Now for Canyonlands. You're riding a bike. You're riding a bike on Mars. Now you're riding the rapids. Class 2, Class 3, Class 4, Classic. Arches, 5:32 a.m. Some things are worth racing the sunrise for. The horizon lightens. You round the corner. Whoa. This is Life Elevated. The Mighty Five. 5 iconic parks, 1 epic experience. Plan your trip at visitutah.com.
I get inspired every time I see it. And so we had a very interesting experience last fall. I'm sure there has been some discussion of it over the last couple of days. When the national parks were shut down, our governor, Governor Herbert, was first in line to say, we can't live with this. The reason is that 13 of our 29 counties have tourism as their #1 economic driver. And as you might imagine, the majority of those are around national parks. And so he went to work, and I will say that I was amazed by his tenacity, that conversations were expedited. He wouldn't let go, and in a short period of time, we became the first state in the country to reopen our national parks. So the economic impact of that was truly astonishing. We invested $999,000. It sounds like a dress on sale or something, but it was just short of $1 million. And we got a 10-to-1 return on our investment by having the parks reopen 6 days before all of the national parks were reopened. And it created a really interesting discussion throughout the state it had a real silver lining in that a lot of Utahns were reminded and were moved to action to go spend time in these remarkable places. And it sort of changed the discussion. Just a few months before that, our governor had named a statewide outdoor recreation director, whose task is really to think about all of these issues in a thoughtful way to figure out how we can really build our state brand and create deliverables for people to have remarkable outdoor recreation experiences. And so all of the drama surrounding the closing of the parks really called attention to that, and I think improved our chances of protecting more open spaces and advancing our tourism economy. As a whole, over the last number of years, tourism has become a huge part of our economy. It competes neck and neck with the extraction industry. Kennecott is huge here. And our numbers are very similar if you looked at tourism as an export industry. So last year, tourists spent $7.4 billion in Utah, and that yielded $960 million in state and local tax revenues. So that's people coming into our state, buying, eating at our restaurants, and staying in our hotels and motels, and buying retail, and then taking their children home to be educated in other states. 71% of that $7.4 billion is out-of-state visitors. We have a huge international visitation. As Kate can tell you, if you go into any of our national parks, it's sort of like being in an international airport, in that there are Germans, UK, French, a huge growing population of Chinese, Australians, Canadians. They come here and spend 2-3 weeks, and they really get out and experience the hiking and other adventure. So the challenges for us are really, I think they've been headlined very nicely by Kate and Ashley. We need to protect not just the parks, but the whole communities, so that having a national park experience is a comprehensive, otherworldly experience where you can really enjoy the vistas, a sense of the communities that support the national parks being congruent with the experience of the national parks. Another thing that hasn't been highlighted by Ashley and Kate that I would throw into the mix is that we need to develop our tourism infrastructure properly. Our hotels and motels and restaurants, and we have a lot of our small communities where you can't get a good cup of coffee, and we've got to change all that. And so that takes a lot of engagement to help people figure out the right place to start. We have a lot of our stores in small communities that close down at 5 o'clock at night, places where everything's closed on Sundays. And so these are the challenges that we think about, are developing the infrastructure properly. Our welcome centers, I don't know if anybody's been to any of our welcome centers lately, but when you walk in, you think maybe you saw a different commercial for a different state, because they just haven't had the investment that's necessary to create a consistent brand experience. Other critical challenges are transportation, figuring out systems so that people aren't sitting in their cars in parks and not able to commute through, good shuttle systems and so forth. We do have a challenge. It's been tragic, the base jumping deaths in the last week of just getting people to understand and respect the rules of the national parks. I'm going to sum up for now so that we can have a good discussion. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dave Nimkin, who's a great steward and advocate for all that we do in our national parks.
I have the honor of being the last PowerPoint of the day. Pause for applause. We're all set? No, not climate change. While we're waiting, I thank you, Bob, and all of the presenters for being here and inviting all of us to focus on this. As noted, I'm the regional director of the National Parks Conservation Association, and I feel like I'm at home because several of the presenters are board members of NPCA, great friends. This is mine, so thank you. Just very briefly, the NPCA may be one of the oldest but maybe less well-known organizations for many, maybe not among this group, was created by Stephen Mather, the first director of the National Park Service, almost 100 years ago, with the recognition that it was important that there be a non-governmental organization that protected these places that were often forged out of conflict. We have regional offices. As noted, I'm the regional director in the Southwest. And there are over 800,000 members and supporters. I know many of you may be around the country, as we're a membership organization. And we work both in collaboration and as strong advocates and voices to protect these parks. You might wonder why that's necessary. Why not pushing the right button? On the right, there we go. Oh, look at that. So I did review these slides beforehand. So the Southwest region is, I think, the most beautiful in the NPCA realm, probably the most complicated. Of the 401 national park units in the U.S., 64 of them are located in this region. And probably because I live in Utah, and I'm with a crowd here of Utahns mostly. I love Utah, and here's a graphic representation of those 13 park units that Kate so adroitly described. I don't think she missed any of them, and each one of them, and I think many of you have been to these places, are miraculous in and of themselves, and places that we all know, we value, we treasure, but they're increasingly threatened in many different ways, and I'm going to speak to that. I'm not going to speak to a lot of these points because they've been covered, but the middle panel, I think, is an important one. We know the parks are huge economic generators. They, as Vicki noted, they help define the brand of this state. But during the shutdown, just to put it in some context, how much revenue was lost at many of these places during those few days before Governor Herbert and Director Jarvis forged that deal with that one guy in the Department of the Treasury and that one lawyer, and they were able to pull that together, maybe for that reason so quickly. But it's a huge issue and something that's really important. Ashley talked about the recreational benefits that really are constituted with those 9 million visitors. how much that means. It's probably not insignificant that the Outdoor Industry Association and the OR show comes here twice a year, and 20 to 25,000 people crowd Salt Lake City with that in mind, and that we have an Office of Outdoor Recreation that's so important for the well-being of our economy. What are the issues that we confront? And sometimes people often say, national parks conservation, aren't you guys a little redundant? Aren't they already protected? What's the point? And I think we are complacent. I think we take things for granted. I think Director Jarvis talked about the relevance of the parks, and I think what we strive to reinforce and represent, to reinforce that if we care about these things, we've got to value them. And the elements that are important, and I'll just briefly touch on some of these, large landscapes, the protection of these intrinsic park values. Each of us have talked about, the last 2 days have talked about the large landscapes of which the parks often are at the center, and the elements outside those parks, the areas that require protection, that are threatened, are areas that we work on, both in park expansion and some of those external threats, looking at connectivity of wildlife corridors and habitats, looking at clean air and clean water that in many cases we are only recognizing when it affects us in the Wasatch Front, when the air is dirty. But when you think about the impact of dirty air in our national park, and you can't see you don't have a grand view from Grandview is not great. Natural quiet, sometimes taken for granted, but the advent of automobiles and motorcycles, the impact on wildlife and predation from large noise sounds, and obviously the night skies, which many people regard the Colorado Plateau as some of the most pristine areas in the country, in the world, in fact, for viewing night skies. So there is also in Utah a recognition of the unique and special cultural significance, not only among Native peoples, but some of the historical places, whether it be the Golden Spike Historic Site and how important that is, and the expansion of those kinds of things. We are working, and we'll talk about a Manhattan project, expansion of Cesar Chavez into Arizona. But some of the risks, some of the things that we work on to help promote, and I'll quickly detail some of them, are in these areas, and they're huge, and they affect every bit of the public lands, not only within the parks, but in the larger areas as well. Let's just look at energy development and the impact of oil and gas development that we have, and the master leasing projects around Canyonlands and Arches. You may know that development project grew out of the conflicts at the end of the Bush administration and the famous 77 leases, and that the BLM has developed in concert with the National Park Service, this master leasing plan, and working closely to find a reasonable and appropriate way to locate energy development within the context of our public lands. Oil shale and tar sands, something we've advocated that requires strong environmental regulation and control and economic validation before it should be continued, and keep the scale of that lower, in part so it does not impact national parks. Looking at air quality, Navajo Generating Station in Arizona, and power plants, massive coal-fired power plants, Four Corners, Navajo Generating Station, San Juan Generating Station. We're working to encourage and support the regional haze standards, sometimes through threat of litigation, oftentimes through negotiations, so that there can be compliance with the federal implementation standards of regional haze. So very critical and so important for those intrinsic values within our national parks. And linking it as well with the concerns that people have about air quality in our own backyard. Looking at water. Here we have just the change in the Colorado River system up by Lake Powell, how, as it used to be, as it is now, focusing on drought, focusing on quantity. What's not often noted is that there are 9 national parks within the Colorado River Basin, beginning with Rocky Mountain National Park and ending with Lake Mead. The impact of our quest for more water, I mean, John Wesley Powell would not recognize the 30 million people that depend upon the Colorado River in this arid region, a region defined by its aridity, as Wallace Stegner talked about. And the importance of maintaining the quality and quantity of water within those national parks is something we work with stridently and aggressively. We look at mining activities, working at coal mining around Bryce Canyon at Alton Coal Mine, and coal strip mining, often involved in litigation on that, as well as working with the Park Service and our allies in trying to do appropriate planning through a NEPA process. Very active in the moratorium on uranium mining around the Grand Canyon. What's not known as the larger landscape of the Grand Canyon includes parts of Kane and parts of southern Utah. And the impact of uranium mining from the 50s on to the native populations is still a horror, and the importance of making sure that we protect the places and we protect the people in that process is critical. And growing threats with potash development in Arizona and in southern Utah is again something that would use huge quantities of water. Some of you maybe from Dead Horse Point have seen the evaporation ponds of potash. That's something that could be potentially growing and would have impact. Development pressures. What you may not know, this is Zion National Park, one of our favorite, most visited national park in Utah. That house is in the national park. That was a private inholding within Zion National Park that was completed about 1.5 years ago. And there are about 1,000 acres. There are more than 1,000 acres. There are lots of private inholdings within Zion National Park. Only recently did we complete, with an anonymous donor to NPCA and with the great assistance of the Trust for Public Land, the acquisition of 30 acres just about 3 miles down the road from where that house is built in Zion National Park. There are more, and the importance of expanding land and water conservation funding would be important. We've used that as well in acquiring land at Petrified Forest National Park, and we're looking at some of that at Rocky Mountain National Park. Climate change. I think we could talk at length. That's the impact up in the headwaters of the Colorado River, up in Rocky Mountain National Park. The pine beetle devastation right up at that high level is a direct impact of the warming trend in our climate, the kind of impacts that are very apparent in the national parks, something that I think people can learn and gain from substantially. Invasive species, drought are continued huge problems. What we do, we educate people about this. We strive and believe very, very fervently that this passivity about the fact that the parks are not as relevant, or that they're already protected despite the extraordinary work of the National Park Service, is something that we strive to reinforce over and over again. I firmly believe, like Director Jarvis said, we sometimes take our parks for granted. They need to retain and build some relevance. And we really need to build a political voice and a stronger voice that people hear. And that's particularly true in Utah. It's particularly true where we live. We do a lot of advocacy. We have, as many of the 800,000 members and supporters know, a lot of e-alerts, a lot of issues that come up that reinforce the importance of people's voices and participation in this public arena, in this public process, to protect our parks in ways that we have assumed that they will be protected, but not if we don't take a stand. We do a lot of collaborating. One of the things that we've done in a lot of ways is work with other groups, work with other stakeholders. Let me just see if we have, I think one of the things with the education, I'll be ahead of myself, just even working with Kate and her staff, you may not even know that there is a huge problem of graffiti at Arches National Park. People dragging rocks across the sandstone. And so we brought groups in on National Public Lands Day. We're thinking about bringing young people from Salt Lake City schools to Arches to clean up the graffiti, have a double meeting, double lesson. But some of that is just recognizing the personal responsibilities we have. Looking at the advocacy and the collaboration, one of the things that many of the people here were involved in, earlier, in November, we organized, it turned out right after the shutdown, a Utah Gateway Community Forum. 25 communities from around the state, their elected leaders, some of their businesses, Park Service personnel, Forest Service, BLM, even U.S. Fish and Wildlife, came together for a day and have sustained in talking about these relationships that require stronger collaboration in working and solving problems. We have now 9 what we call community action teams that are involved in trying to sort through problems such as community development and retaining environmental integrity and housing needs, looking at the relationships of gateways to these protected public lands. That we involved and engaged a larger swatch of public land management in this process is indicative of the importance that we all talk to solve some of these problems. And then we're not ignoring the potential for litigation. And we've been strong in partnership in challenging some of the BLM resource management plans that have enabled some of the off-road vehicle use and energy development adjacent to national parks and on our public lands that have been problematic. The Alton coal mine I mentioned, uranium mining and sustaining the moratorium that is being challenged by industry. And then we don't have a lot of time for RS 2477 discussion, but that continues to be part of that problem. So I thank you all. I know that we've run long, but I think it's important with this conference how important our national parks are on so many different levels, the role that you all play, that we all play in sustaining them forever. So thank you.
We did want to carry this discussion a little bit further after that tremendous introduction to our parks, the issues, challenges that confront them. As should be evident, the folks that we have here on stage are right in the midst of that. And let me see if I can start the discussion, and then we'd like to bring everyone in. And I've encouraged our panelists to be willing to give and take amongst themselves. But one of the points that came through, has come through to me for quite some time, is that we recognize the economic potential of the parks, the impact on gateway communities. We're busy marketing the parks, both at the private sector level and at the governmental level. And at the same time, as Kate suggested, our visitors get overly rambunctious. Is there a way to address marketing in such a way so that we don't negatively impact either resources in the park or the visitor experience?
He's looking at me. Yeah, that's an interesting one. What we have found that the most useful place that we can play in that is through our increased digital communications. The world is changing from learning about things through TV ads, and since I came into this role a little over a year ago, we've doubled our digital engagement. That's all different types of social media and so forth. And so we find that to be the best way to get more complex messages like this out there. And we've taken several opportunities to use our social media that way. But I think the other important thing that we're trying to improve is we're in the midst of an integrated global branding strategy for the state to expand the Utah Life Elevated brand from a tourism brand to a brand that all of our citizens can engage and feel motivated by the differentiating qualities of Utah Life Elevated. And as part of that, I think all of us as citizens need to be ambassadors about proper respect for the land. And that's everyone that tourists interact with, from the time that they arrive at a hotel to their interactions at restaurants to Utahns engaging them positively during their travels, to sort of set to role model the way we should be interacting with our public lands.
I would just add that managing experiences, that's the product that we're selling, is the experience. And so there are those, we look at the landscape as these colored polygons, and if we start looking at it more as what are the experiences that people are having in different polygons, if you manage that, like Kate mentioned, if you're actively managing that, it's okay for the parks to be more restricted, and in fact it's appropriate and right. It's just a question of, if they really must base jump, that they know where to go, that we provide some other place for that would be more appropriate, or if we decide it's not right at all. But it's a question of looking at it more from just different zones to what are the experiences that we're trying to manage and how do we manage them. And if we do a better job of that, that will help solve this issue.
And I just add, one of the outcomes we hope from the Gateway Forum activity is a recognition that communities have the responsibility. Oftentimes people define some of their experience with a national park by the connection or relationship they have within that community. It's the restaurant, it's the hotel, it's the friendliness of the people. And so one of the elements we're hoping for is that communities can define what they want. Monticello in southern Utah or Blanding does not want to be Moab, but we wouldn't mind a little bit of that revenue. But what is the limit for that? And what kind of planning, what kind of infrastructure do they need to support, and how can we support that kind of infrastructure that can grow to the level that they feel would be appropriate and balance their economy?
Yeah, can I ask a question? This is a historic question, and it's more, I just finished reading Doris Kearns' book on Teddy Roosevelt and Howard Taft, and those were not polite times, but they got a lot of conservation done. Why are we being so polite and not getting much conservation done?
Okay, Pat, I'll take that one. I'm not sure it's always so polite. I don't know if it seems polite here or now. I think that there is clearly a need to build a base of support and to challenge the complacency, I believe, that we all experience. I don't know how you all feel, but I'm pretty disgusted with the dysfunctional political climate that we live in and we operate in. And but those people represent us, are supposed to represent us, and oftentimes our voices are not heard and are not considered. We accept it, we're complacent, and I think part of what I feel is a value of the national parks is that that's sort of a common denominator that people do care about. It's funny when you talk about it, maybe venturing into some area, that you have Chris Stewart is a congressman in the state of Utah. He represents several national parks on the west side of this state in Capitol Reef. He is someone who strongly supports how important the parks are to our economy. He's a member now of the Appropriations Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives in the majority party. And do you know how much money the Park Service doesn't have in its operating budget? About $600 million a year. How much backlog of infrastructure is about $11 billion. The importance of our voices to those people that presumably represent us and that frankly are not congruent. What they say and what they do are different. They need to be held accountable. And I think it's our role and our responsibility to make that happen.
I'm not being polite to the oil companies. I mean, I'm being conversant and productive, but I'm not shy.
Question? Yes, my question is for the tourism director. I'm down here in front, over here. And I've been to 4 of the top 5, of the big 5, so I'm very excited. They are spectacular. And I was really intrigued to see your advertising campaign, and you said that you have launched it locally and also on the West Coast. You also mentioned the tremendous visitation that you have from overseas visitors. And I'm curious as to whether your campaign actually is targeted to members of urban communities who are primarily people of color, whom I didn't see. I might have missed them in any of the images. But I am asking that in view of the fact that while we can have considerable revenue from foreign visitors, they do not in fact have a voice in the protection of our national parks into perpetuity. And so I'm curious as to where you are on that.
So this was actually a Utah family, a mom and dad and 2 kids, and they were all white as could be. And so you didn't see any color in those ads. In terms of the ethnic mix of our visitors, that's actually one of the things that I meant to reference in my opening remarks, is that one of the many challenges that we face is that we're not able to gather that information from the national parks. And this goes back to budget constraints, that we're not, I don't have any way of measuring other than what we all experience anecdotally. And that's that we have a huge growing population of international visitors from the countries that I mentioned, and we have enormous potential with the South American market. Brazil and Mexico in particular have growing middle and upper middle classes. But in terms of your second point, the lack of opportunity for people from outside the United States to influence the land conservation debate. I think that's a very good point. I do know that a lot of international conservationists have chosen to participate in the discussion by contributing to Southern Utah Wilderness Association and other groups that are trying to protect land. So that's one way that they can participate in the discussion, but I'd be very interested in observations from others about, it's every country has its own rules of engagement, and it's kind of hard for the rest of the world to participate in U.S. Directly impacting U.S. public policy.
I might not have communicated accurately, because what I mean is you partially depend upon the extent to which the growing demographic groups support them, and lobby their congressional representatives to appropriate dollars for them. So in that context, I am asking whether your marketing campaign is actually focused on targeting urban communities and communities of color that are the growing demographic groups.
Yeah, so we don't, I wish we could be that precise, but we are targeting large metropolitan areas. For the 3-season campaign, I'll stay focused on that, we are targeting large metropolitan areas along the West Coast and in our surrounding states. So, Denver, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and then going right up the coast, at Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sacramento, San Diego, Portland, and Seattle. And the reason we target those markets is that they're drive-in markets, and that's where we get the highest probability of people going to the effort to book a trip. And so the ethnic mix of people who see those ads really reflects the ethnic mix of those different communities. And we don't have the resources that we've been able to be any more targeted than that.
The Outdoor Industry Association is thinking hard about that issue of targeting urban populations and getting them involved in public lands. So there are people working on it, but more just to get them to buy the product. The point I think you were making too is that once you get them to buy the product and care about it, since they're going to be the evolving bigger portion of the population, we need to be making sure that we close that loop and get them involved in the conservation of it. So there are some groups that are working on it for sure.
Steve?
I wanted to ask Kate if there's any chance that the park superintendents and the park staff are able to plan for this, to plan regionally. So Vicki is trying to attract everyone to come to visit all 5 national parks in Utah, and they're different. And Zion and Arches are heavily used, and Capitol Reef and Canyonlands are much less used. And is there a chance for, and you have the chance to manage 2 parks, but how much regional planning is there in Utah and even around the Colorado Plateau?
Steve, do you mean planning to distribute visitors amongst us? Amongst the parks,
yeah, or interpretive planning to imagine someone entering the plateau at Colorado National Monument and leaving at Lake Mead, and how do you handle them as they pass through all those parks? What kinds of experiences?
I think there's a lot more that we could do in that regard, and that might be one way to address some of the issues that we're experiencing now. Right now, we do that planning on a fairly incidental basis, just communicating with each other and talking. But actually, that's a particularly good idea and might be one that we'll work on in the next little while. I think many of us are here today.
Just building on that a little bit, I'm wondering if anyone's taken a look at international examples of that. Costa Rica comes to mind, where as a country they decided we're going to have an international marketing plan and market our country as a place for people to come and have these experiences that you're talking about. And I'm wondering if historically either marketing or the MPCA or anyone else has looked at international examples in that type of interagency or collaborative approach.
I mean, would almost look to Bob or to Denny, who have been involved with NPCA and the larger scale planning and thoughtful considerations that have gone into the Second Century Commission or Future Parks, New Parks. Have those been considered? Maybe back at you, Bob, or Denny, maybe.
In that report I referenced this morning, Planning for the 21st Century, we looked at Canadian plans, Costa Rican plans, state comprehensive outdoor recreation plans, state historic plans. We did not, and they have, many of them have targets, numerical targets to protect landscapes. We didn't recommend any, but we recommended that the Park Service take a look at those, all of those plans. And we also did looked at a couple of Australian plans. And you're right, there's for the most part, I think in terms of comprehensive planning about parks, Costa Rica's ahead of us, Canada's ahead of us, Australia's ahead of us. They've really given some thought as to how much of their country they want to protect and how they get from here to there.
I can speak up. My question would be that Utah has several brands, one being Life Elevated, but we have another brand in Utah which is a general hostility towards public lands. And that is probably more widely distributed in the Life Elevated brand. I guess I'd like to ask this panel, because of your backgrounds and your knowledge, do you think the dissonance between those two rhetorical positions has a major impact on the way parks are managed and what the future of our parks are? And then sort of the follow-up point is, while all the groups in Utah that are involved in conservation speak with their own voices about these issues, it does seem to me that, with the possible exception of the outdoor retailers group who has spoken out, I don't see a collective voice from the parks themselves or the supporters taking on that rhetoric about public lands. They don't seem to be front and center to say that when we hear those voices, that needs to be viewed as a threat to what we all enjoy from our public lands, in particular our parks.
And are you referring specifically to HB 148?
Well, that's one, but I mean, the brand of Utah is much broader than that. We've been, of course, advertising our hostility towards public lands for many decades, and that's probably just this week's version of that same view. I think when visitors come to Utah, what they remember is they love the parks, and remember that the people in Utah are generally dismissive of the parks and would like to get rid of them and the public lands. And it seems to me that distance must leave the visitor somewhat confused.
Well, I think speaking from like the mountain biking community or the skiing community or climbing, I think that a lot of those real groups of enthusiasts, they see the Mother Nature gave us all the great places, and they aren't as concerned with the politics until some places actually closed. But so there's the good news is there's a bunch of enthusiasts in these different groups that really want to come here. It's on their bucket list. This is super important to them, and they haven't really. They're maybe concerned about the drinking, but they haven't really gotten the word about about how we feel. That. But I think at some point it is going to be a problem, and especially. As the groups like IMBA or the Access Fund for Climbing or whatever engage in the questions around 148 and how that evolves.
Yeah, I would just speak a little bit to the, how do you confront that decades of resistance to federal ownership of federal lands and the hostility towards that. We work on that every day in many different ways, and many of them are not known. So some of it is, working to protect public lands from off-road use, looking at energy development use and how that can protect places. The premise behind the Gateway Forum is to say, are there people who may not even recognize how important the national parks and the protected public lands to their economic base may be, who can somehow be converted into challenge from a local base the traditional view that Utah is hostile to this. I mean, there's a historical imperative of why that exists. How you change it, I think, is a sort of tangled process of engaging a lot more people in doing that. And as kind of Ashley says, sometimes there are elements about how people know about Utah and it's more stereotypical. I think those of us that live in Utah, recognize that dissonance, but I'm not entirely sure that people that come and visit and come from outside regard and recognize that dissonance as much. But I think, our work and the work we do with many of our conservation allies every day is about trying to challenge and find some ways that can reinforce the value, the relevance of our protected public lands, and particularly our national parks.
Bob,
I'll just say,
question. Sorry.
I'll just say very briefly that I've been in Utah public policy for 30 years, and my experience is that almost any time you're in a room full of Utahns, you have pretty reasonable, moderate people who I think any tourist would be pleased and impressed by their interactions with. And what we're trying to accomplish through this integrated global branding campaign is to make all our moderate, reasonable voices a little bit louder and easier to understand, and recognizing that there's always going to be something out there that's going to capture a crazy headline about our state. That's just that's just a fact. But the more the world can see reasonable public policy, like we're discussing today, like is being advanced in lots of different quarters, the more they can see that our governor is the first to reopen the national parks in a crisis, and so forth. I think the more we can overshadow those random and inconsistent experiences.
And I would really like to second that, because in my time in Utah, I think I see that the majority of the rhetoric comes from a small minority of the people. The vast majority of Utahns are more silent and more quiet and do not necessarily share those extreme views. And I do think that one of the characteristics of Utahns is their personal love and attachment for the land, including parks and other protected places. And I agree. I think that much as I would like more Utahns who are silent to speak up, I think they know and I know that the rhetoric doesn't represent the majority of people here.
So we've heard a number of times about the governor being the first to step up and work closely with the Park Service to get the parks open again during the government shutdown. And now that several months have passed and we can look back at that, I was wondering if any of you have considered or would consider answering whether or not there were any reservations or drawbacks. Was that in fact an appropriate step to take, and should that be considered again, or should we be thinking about how we do that should it come up again, ethically, operationally? Was it a purely 100% good step to take, or were there some pitfalls?
I would like to say that when I compare the before and the after, what do you think is more appropriate, to have park rangers manning barricades or opening the gate? I know what I think, and I was delighted to have the parks open and visitors coming in and getting to see these beautiful places that are theirs.
So I'm a concessioner in Canyonlands. And I had people coming from around the country to go into Canyonlands during that time. So on the one hand, yes, I'm thankful that the parks reopened. We were sending people to all kinds of Hatch Point and all kinds of other places because we didn't want to cancel their vacation. But the point that I was really trying to make in the presentation is that it's not just about the parks. The recreation economy is about all the lands around the park. So great that the park was opened, but we still didn't have any BLM rangers. I was running an event in Moab where we had 1,000 people coming. And the BLM called the day before and said, technically we're supposed to cancel your event, but we're just not going to notice. that you ran it. So I was like, okay, I'll tell all 1,000 people to just keep a low profile. I mean, it's about, like, the whole federal land system affects the parks. So yes, we definitely appreciated that the governor did that, but and we also appreciate the silver lining of how much people have realized how important the parks are. But we needed the BLM rangers and the Forest Service to be working too. So it's a tricky. I mean, we need the Congress to function. Bottom line. So it really can't. It's not something that we need to be. We need to make plans to make the Congress work, not make plans for what happens when the Congress doesn't work.
The only downside, I would say, is what Ashley's just articulated. If we had been able to do more, it would have created even broader benefits, and that's what I've heard from the tourism community around the state. But it was meant so much to people coming from all over the world. I mean, you hear all the stories about people who had planned their honeymoons here, and so the personal experience. I think it was 175,000 people who were able to get access to the park in those 6 days. It was golden. And then the economies, the benefit to the local economies that depend so heavily on the tourism.
And I would just say we just need to call that whole episode what it is a very consequential political stunt that backfired. And, my hope would be that it wouldn't happen again, just because it seemed to serve no purpose. And, to the credit of the governor and John Jarvis, they acted very adult-like and worked something out that benefited a lot of people, and I think we should, recognize that.
This is just a quick one on economics. I'm just curious, so Vicki, it probably is for you. Do you know how much of the income that comes to the state through tourism? I know you said there's a $10 return for every dollar spent. Billion, lots comes into the state, but how much capital leakage is there, or how much of that profit actually stays in the state versus going to corporations that are outside who maybe own hotels and things like that?
I've never seen a good measure of that. I know that in terms of the tax revenues, $960 million in tax revenues, 571 of it is state tax revenues, and the remainder is local tax revenues. How much of it flows out of state to other corporations? We've never had that sophisticated of research.
Well, I'm pretty sure that it's a lot less than oil and gas.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a great study to do, to look at recreation corporate leakage versus oil and gas. Yeah.
You have been extraordinarily patient. We've run over a bit here, I think for very good reasons. Our panelists have been insightful, provocative, and thoughtful in addressing the challenges and opportunities for Utah National Parks. Please join me in thanking them once again for the presentation.